and welcome back. This is episode 13 of my vlog series about creating the art for a 2D video game. And we are on the floor this morning. So I started trying to film and the baby kept knocking over my camera and trying to mess with my lights, and I just finally decided, forget it, we're just going to put some toys on the floor and let her go nuts. So that's what we're doing today. So anyway, thank you for joining us on the floor this morning. I hope you had a fantastic week and happy Friday. Today I'm going to be showing you footage of me drawing just one building today. So I think it was the last episode. I start to lose track of what I've said when, but I think it was on our last episode that I mentioned that our peasants have been getting smarter. And that continues to be true. So your peasants have something called morale, and morale basically determines how efficiently your peasants do their job. So if your peasants are unhappy, they're not going to do their best work for you. And if they are happy, they're going to work much more, they're going to be much more productive. And so there are different ways that you can go about raising or lowering, morale, depending on what your goals are. There's certainly, poor conditions will lower morale, and good conditions, whether that's food, living conditions, weather, whatever, will raise morale. And so one of the ways that you can go about raising your peasants' morale is to give them a tavern. So it basically gives them somewhere that they can go and relax and unwind at the end of a long workday. And so that's what I'm going to be drawing for you today. I've actually finished both the exterior and the interior of the tavern. But once I uploaded all the footage, it was just like a lot of footage. It was just hours. And by the time I sped it up to like a watchable speed, you would lose, I think, some of the process because it just goes by, like that. So today I'm just going to show you me drawing the exterior of the tavern. Next week I'll show me drawing the interior, all of the furnishings and that sort of thing. And then next week I'll also show you the gameplay where the tavern is actually implemented. It is up and running. So next week I'll show you some gameplay. But without further ado, let's go ahead and switch over to my screen, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, here we are in Photoshop, and as you can see, I've already got a bit of a sketch in place, and I'm also using the hovel there in the background. And the reason I do that, a lot of times I'll drop in like an existing building when I'm drawing a new one. The reason I do that basically is just for scale. I know that I want the tavern to be bigger than the hovel, but I also want to make sure things like, doors and windows, that sort of thing, are in scale to other structures that are already existing. So that's what I'm working on right now, is I've got that sketch and I'm just working on the line work for this tavern. And something that you'll see me fiddling with a lot is the roof. Most of our buildings here in your home kingdom, at least at this point, have like thatched roofs. And I've drawn them different ways. I suppose if I was less lazy, I should come up with like a consistent way of drawing them, but I kind of change it up depending on the building and what I think looks right. And this one I tried, I can't remember, three or four, I guess we'll find out as we watch it, but 3 or 4 different ways of drawing this thatched roof before I finally landed on the one I liked best. And even though you don't ever really see it, except for brief little flashes in these videos, I do actually spend a lot of time just researching and looking up reference images for pretty much everything I've drawn in this game. I mean, unless it's something I've drawn 1,000 times before, I use reference images from, Pinterest, Google Images. I have family who have done a lot of traveling, and I'll look at photos that they've taken. And I think that really helps to just give your artwork in general, whether or not you're making a game, but it just kind of grounds it in reality. And even though we are not trying to create something that is, quote-unquote realistic, I still think it's a really good idea to reference things that are real, because it just makes it more relatable to your audience. So this game is going to have a lot of elements of fantasy. I mean, a lot of it's just kind of quirky and ridiculous, but there's also, we're going to have dragons that you can raise as on your farm, and, just things like that, magic and wizards and that sort of thing. But at the same time, I want it to have a sort of medieval, European kind of feel to it, because that is something we are familiar with. And so that's where, you know, reference images can really come in handy, because I have never actually been to Europe. I've barely been outside of the United States, and so thank goodness, you know, we live in an age of the internet, and I have, you know, at the touch of a button, I can have as many images as I want, you know, of other parts of the world. And so I take advantage of that and I use them because it reminds me to include little details, you know, in my pictures that I might not think of otherwise. You know, even things as small as like adding the leaded glass, you know, to these windows. I was looking at a whole bunch of different pictures of these really cool thatched roof buildings, you know, over in England, I think primarily, and a lot of them had these really cool like leaded glass windows, and it formed, you know, this really interesting diamond pattern. And I love little details like that. So, you know, I included it in this little tavern picture here, and it's something I wouldn't have thought of if I wasn't, you know, spending time doing a little bit of research. So I guess if I had to pick, you know, what my main, you know, pro tip is for today, I guess I would say to take advantage of references. I think, you know, especially when I was younger, I used to think that really good artists made up everything out of their heads. And that is not true at all, I've come to find. Most of the time, you know, really good artists, even if they're, you know, quote unquote making stuff up, they're not reinventing the wheel. So buildings exist, so we should probably use them to design even fantastical settings or fantastical buildings. Same thing, you'll see artists when they're creating like a fantastical landscape, they will still base that in reality. You know, they'll go out and do a photo shoot of the mountains or the desert or a setting that's similar to the one that they are trying to create, and then they use that as kind of a jumping off point for what they end up actually drawing and painting. And as often as possible, I would always advise people to, of course, you know, take their own reference photos. That's just, for one thing, of course, you can get all of the angles of an object or a person or a structure that you want. So if you're just, you know, searching on Google Images for a building, you might be able to get one face of that building, but you might not necessarily be able to get it from another angle, which means you're going to have to invent more. And if you're able to take your own reference photos, that's always ideal because, of course, you can take all of the angles that you need, you can get in on all of the little details that you might need, and that's just, you know, it's a good way to save yourself a lot of time and effort later when it comes time to draw it and you don't have to start, you know, inventing everything from your head. Of course, you know, in this case, as I mentioned before, I have never been to Europe, and there aren't too many thatch roof taverns down here in Texas. And so I kind of, in this case, didn't have a whole lot of choice except to, you know, of course I look at existing buildings to just kind of get the structure. There's plenty of houses on my street that are 2 stories and have chimneys, and I certainly look at those. But then when it actually comes to doing like the thatched roof and the cool like leaded glass windows, that's where I turn to Google. And in this case, of course, it also really helps that I'm only drawing this building from one angle. Of course, I do have one more tip for you. If you're really looking to get like an exotic looking building or setting that is nowhere close to where you live, and you want several shots, if possible, of like the same location, try Google Street View. It's really useful. And I've done this before myself. Like, for example, I was working on a comic a couple of years ago, just a short little comic pitch, and I wanted a building. I had a building in my head from my hometown. It was a little house that I knew it was just a few streets over from my grandma's house, and I knew that I wanted to draw something that looked like that. So, like a total creeper, I got on Google Street View and zoomed in, found the house, and because you can maneuver, you know, up and down the street in different directions, and sometimes even get into like a back, you know, back around the back side of the house if there's a street that goes that way, you can get lots of good, just take screenshots and you can get lots of good angles on the same building. Another thing you can also do, here's another kind of creepy thing that you can do, you can also get on like Zillow or any like website that lists homes for sale, and the really good thing about that one is that you get pictures of the exterior, usually like front, back, maybe some pictures of the yard, and you also get pictures of the interior. So if you really want to be super creepy, and I do this all the time, no shame, You get on Zillow or some other website where they're listing real estate, homes for sale, and just start looking at those pictures, and you can put together a very convincing home in this case, or a very convincing yard, or whatever, because all of the legwork of taking the photos has already been done for you. Of course, that being said, I would advise, unless you can get permission from the photographer to use their images as reference, I would definitely advise changing some things. You really don't want to copy, unless you're doing a study, which in that case you would want to copy the reference as exactly as possible. But if you're using it for another project, for a game, for a comic, whatever, I would definitely advise changing the reference so it is not necessarily recognizable as somebody else's photograph. And there's a lot of different ways that you can go about making those changes, and of course one of my favorite ones is just to combine a couple of different reference photos. So rather than working straight from one reference picture, you take two pictures of the same thing, and you use elements of both of those. So for example, this tavern that I'm drawing, I looked at a lot of different pictures of buildings, and I narrowed it down to about 3 that I really wanted to try and, capture. There was a couple of them that were like 2-story buildings, and one of them was a single story, but I really liked like the big mounded shape of the roof, so I took the roof shape from that picture. I took, the 2-story element from another picture. The cool, like, sort of arched windows, I think that was in just one of the images, and so, and of course the chimney, I saw, I think it was a couple of the pictures actually had, like, brick chimneys, but one didn't. And so anyway, just by mixing and matching and combining, I created a building that is not really recognizable as anything I pulled out of the real world. Even though, essentially I did just that. I did pull it out of the real world, but if you can't recognize it, then I got away with it. So there you go. That's your pro tip for the day. And I hope that you've enjoyed watching me draw this tavern. Of course, I'll be back next week, and as I said before, I will show you all the furnishings that I made for this tavern, which is really fun for me to do, by the way. I really enjoy drawing, like, the interiors of some of these buildings. But I'll show you the furnishings next week and show you some gameplay so you can see actually how it looks in game. So until then, I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next Friday. Bye.